In the bustling streets of medieval towns, where the clang of the blacksmith's hammer mingled with the cries of merchants, there existed another world, hidden, yet strangely public. Behind closed doors, in dimly lit rooms tucked between taverns and market stalls, stood the brothels. They were both condemned and tolerated, whispered about by priests yet frequented by nobles, merchants, and students alike. Here, within these shadowed chambers, society revealed its contradictions. A place where sin was both punished and taxed, where women's bodies became a form of currency, and where the poor and powerful brushed shoulders in search of fleeting satisfaction. To step into a medieval brothel was to enter a paradox. Outside, the church bell tolled, summoning the faithful to repentance. Inside, laughter, bargaining, and moans of pleasure echoed against rough timber walls. The brothel was not merely a house of desire, it was an institution woven into the very fabric of urban life. Kings and bishops railed against fornication, yet city officials collected revenue from it. Theologians denounced lust as a deadly sin, but magistrates recognized that without regulated brothels, chaos might spill into the streets. Thus, the brothel lived in a twilight zone, suspended between damnation and necessity. Price lists were pinned, whispered, or memorized like the menus of taverns. For a single coin, a laborer could buy an hour of company. For a pouch of silver, a merchant could demand more elaborate services. Young girls fetched higher prices, while women past their prime offered themselves for scraps of bread or ale. In some towns, municipal records survive that detail exactly how much was paid for the common woman's service, setting tariffs as if human intimacy were as ordinary as salt or flour. These lists were not fantasy. They were bureaucracy, the cold hand of regulation pressing upon flesh and passion. Yet brothels were not wild havens of freedom. Beneath the surface ran laws, some written, many unwritten, that governed their operation. Women could not walk the streets without certain garments marking them as prostitutes. Brothels were forbidden near churches but permitted near marketplaces, ensuring they were close enough to generate income while far enough from holy ground. Those who ran these houses paid bribes to sheriffs or town bailiffs, ensuring protection in exchange for silence. It was an economy of shadows, where coins greased palms and power dictated who could sin without consequence. For the women themselves, life inside was far from the bawdy fantasies painted by later ages. Many were there by force of poverty, abandoned by families, or lured by promises of survival. They carried not only the burden of stigma, but the weight of constant danger, disease, abuse, and the ever-watchful eyes of men who saw them as both necessary and disposable. Their existence embodied society's hypocrisy, damned as sinners, yet indispensable as guardians of chastity for respectable women, providing men an outlet so wives and daughters might remain untouched. The air of secrecy surrounding brothels only deepened their mystique. Gossip flowed through taverns about knights who disguised themselves to slip into the red-lit doorways, about priests caught in scandal, about students squandering their father's money. These tales were passed like contraband, whispered with smirks but tinged with unease, for everyone knew that brothels revealed truths people pretended not to see. They were mirrors of human weakness, reflections of desire dressed in coin and shadows. To understand medieval brothels is to confront the raw, unvarnished reality of a society built on contradictions. They were places of pleasure, but also of pain, of profit, but also of exploitation. The price lists and hidden laws that governed them reveal not only what men were willing to pay, but what society was willing to permit. And in those lists, in every coin exchanged, every whispered bargain, lies the story of a civilization wrestling with morality, necessity, and desire. To understand how brothels became a fixture of medieval towns, one must look back further into the deep roots of European history. The concept of organized prostitution did not spring from the Middle Ages alone. It was inherited, reshaped, and adapted from earlier civilizations. Ancient Rome had its lupanaria, public brothels regulated by the state, where services were catalogued as meticulously as a soldier's pay. When Rome fell, much of its civic order crumbled, but the appetite for control over desire remained. By the 12th and 13th centuries, cities across Europe revived this Roman logic. If lust could not be eradicated, it must be contained. Medieval rulers and city councils framed brothels not as indulgences, but as necessities. Theologians and magistrates alike argued that they were the lesser evil. Better, they reasoned, to channel male desire into designated houses than to risk adultery, seduction of virgins, or assaults upon respectable women. This justification reveals much about medieval gender and power. The chastity of noblewomen and maidens was prized above all, while the bodies of prostitutes were treated as sacrificial buffers. Brothels thus became state-sanctioned safety valves, tolerated sins meant to preserve the supposed moral order. The rise of urban centers in the High Middle Ages gave new urgency to the regulation of lust. Towns swelled with students, merchants, and soldiers, men far from their homes, with coin to spend and appetites to satisfy. Inns and taverns became breeding grounds for illicit encounters, often violent and unchecked. Municipal authorities feared not only disorder, but also disease and scandal. In response, they began designating official brothel districts, where sex could be taxed, supervised, and policed. The chaos of unregulated desire was thus brought under the watchful eye of city law. Each city's approach differed, but the logic was the same. In Paris, the Rue Bailhaut housed licensed prostitutes, their work sanctioned by the Crown. In London, the infamous Bankside brothels were technically owned by the Bishop of Winchester, a fact that scandalized moralists for centuries and gave rise to the term Winchester geese for the women who worked there. In German towns, council records reveal ordinances dictating where brothels could operate and how they were to be managed. Across Europe, the brothel shifted from an unspoken vice to an official institution, woven into the economic and political fabric of urban life. But beneath these pragmatic justifications lay contradictions. The Church thundered against fornication from pulpits, yet tolerated brothels when they were profitable or politically convenient. Some monasteries and bishops collected taxes from them openly, disguising this income under vague entries in their ledgers. The hypocrisy was blatant. Sin was condemned as a path to damnation, but when properly taxed, it became a source of divine revenue. This uneasy alliance between morality and necessity defined the origins of the medieval brothel. Prostitution itself carried a dual identity. On the one hand, prostitutes were branded as sinners, their very presence a reminder of human weakness. On the other hand, they were viewed as performing a public service, sparing honest women from harassment. St. Augustine himself, centuries earlier, had declared that prostitution was like the sewer of a city. Remove it, and the entire place would overflow with filth. Medieval lawmakers inherited this metaphor, treating prostitutes as indispensable outcasts, tolerated only so long as they served a purpose. Thus, the origins of the medieval brothel reveal more than lust. They expose the social machinery of control. By channeling desire into official spaces, rulers could claim to safeguard morality, while also filling their coffers. Prostitutes became both scapegoats and tools, burdened with society's disdain, but essential to its order. The brothel, born of contradictions, grew from these pragmatic beginnings into a defining feature of medieval towns, a place at once reviled, regulated, and relied upon. If the medieval brothel was an institution, then its price lists were its ledger of power, a brutal reflection of how society measured flesh. These lists, recorded in scraps of parchment, whispered through tavern gossip, or enforced by city officials, transformed desire into a hierarchy of coin. In some towns, they were surprisingly precise, as if ordering intimacy were no different than buying bread, wine, or cloth. Behind every figure lay a hidden economy, revealing who could afford pleasure, who was exploited, and how human bodies were commodified in chilling detail. For the poorest, a single copper penny might secure an hour with a woman of little means. Such encounters were quick, rough, and often carried out in the least desirable rooms, foul-smelling chambers with straw-stuffed pallets, dimly lit by guttering candles. For the laborer, that coin might represent a day's wage, a costly indulgence chosen over food or drink. The transaction stripped romance to its bare bones, survival on one side, fleeting escape on the other. At higher prices, the services grew more elaborate. A silver coin might buy not only physical intimacy, but also time, an evening with wine, conversation, and the illusion of companionship. Prostitutes skilled in music, dance, or witty banter could demand more, entertaining merchants and students who longed for something beyond crude release. In the stratified economy of desire, eloquence and charm became as valuable as beauty. For some men, the illusion of refinement mattered more than the act itself. The hierarchy extended further still. Young girls, prized for their youth, fetched the highest fees, a fact that reveals the darkest side of medieval prostitution. Records from certain towns show that these prices could climb to sums rivaling a craftsman's monthly wage. Nobles, bishops, and wealthy merchants often sought such exclusive services, cloaking their indulgences under secrecy or bribes. Meanwhile, older women, derisively called cheap meat in some records, were forced to lower their prices to mere scraps of bread or mugs of ale. Age was not respected here. It was punished. Municipal records from places like Avignon, Paris, and London reveal startling details. In some cities, councils tried to fix rates, ensuring that prostitutes did not overcharge or compete too fiercely with one another. These regulations read like dry market rules, yet they exposed an obsession with control, how much a body was worth, what services could be expected, and where transactions could occur. Flesh was catalogued with the same bureaucratic detachment as grain or wine, as though intimacy itself were simply another taxable commodity. The price lists also served another purpose. They drew clear boundaries between classes of men. The poor, with their copper pennies, were confined to the most degraded spaces. The wealthy, armed with silver and gold, could demand privacy, comfort, and the company of the most sought-after women. Brothels became mirrors of society's inequalities, where even in the pursuit of pleasure, class dictated experience. Desire was universal, but access was stratified, and money carved its cruel lines across flesh. For the women, these lists meant life or death. A few, able to charge higher fees, might claw their way toward independence, purchasing fine clothes or bribing officials to secure better treatment. But most lived at the mercy of price, their worth rising and falling with their age, beauty, or skill. Behind every tariff was a story of survival, of women forced to measure their very existence in coin, selling not only their bodies, but fragments of their dignity. In the end, the brothel's price lists were not simply menus of sin. They were mirrors of a society willing to reduce intimacy, desire, and survival into neat columns of currency. They revealed who had power and who did not, who could purchase indulgence and who was forced to sell themselves for bread. In these lists, cold and cruel, the medieval world's obsession with hierarchy, control, and coin was laid bare, more revealing than any sermon or law. If the price lists were the visible face of medieval brothels, the laws, both written and unwritten, were their skeleton, hidden yet unyielding. Official decrees often dictated where brothels could stand, what hours they might operate, and even what clothes the women were required to wear. But beneath this surface of regulation existed a darker, more elusive network of secret codes, bribes, and underground rules known only to those who lived and profited within the shadows. Municipal authorities in many towns banned brothels from standing too close to churches or monasteries, fearing that proximity to holy sites would stain their sacredness. Yet they simultaneously placed these houses near markets and riverbanks, where traffic was thick and profit high. In London, Bankside's brothels thrived under the bishop's ownership, while across the Channel, Avignon, home of the papal court, became infamous for its flourishing red light district. These contradictions reflected society's willingness to bend morality when coin outweighed conscience. But what truly sustained brothels were the unwritten laws. Women in certain towns had to wear distinct garments, often striped hoods or sashes, marking them as prostitutes. This badge of shame was not merely symbolic, it was legal branding, making their identities public and ensuring they could be controlled, watched, and, if necessary, punished. Yet within these restrictions, women crafted their own codes of survival, adopting nicknames, using gestures to signal availability, or developing quiet alliances with tavern keepers who offered them protection. Bribes kept the system alive. Brothel owners regularly paid sheriffs, bailiffs, or town watchmen to turn a blind eye when laws were bent. If a wealthy client wished to meet discreetly with a married nobleman's wife or a young servant girl, money exchanged hands until silence was purchased. The underground economy extended far beyond the price of flesh. It encompassed networks of corruption where justice could be delayed, evidence destroyed, and scandals buried beneath gold. There were also the unspoken rules enforced by violence. A prostitute who defied her madam, who tried to escape debt or secretly kept her earnings, risked beatings or worse. Brothels were not gentle places. They were institutions run with ruthless pragmatism. Some cities allowed prostitutes to live semi-independently, but others bound them into servitude, trapped by debts they could never repay. Violence was both punishment and deterrent, ensuring the machinery of the trade ran smoothly. Clients, too, navigated this hidden legal world. Students in Paris, often notorious for disorder, were known to riot when brothels raised prices, forcing officials to intervene. Nobles demanded secrecy, using coded knocks, disguises, or backdoors to avoid public shame. Even clergy members, who officially thundered against fornication, were frequent visitors, shielded by clerical privilege or bribery that ensured their names never reached public record. Thus, underground law became not just about controlling women, but about protecting powerful men. The paradox was clear. Society condemned prostitution as sinful, yet relied on a system of laws, both official and secret, that enabled it. This hypocrisy made the brothel a peculiar mirror of medieval life. In its walls, morality was not absolute but negotiable, shaped by coin, power, and survival. Women were branded sinners, yet also policed like civil servants. Men were told to avoid temptation, yet quietly granted ways to indulge. In every city, these secret codes created a fragile balance. Too much exposure risked scandal. too much secrecy risked chaos. It was within this tension that the medieval brothel thrived, not simply as a house of lust, but as a legal and social contradiction that revealed the uneasy marriage of sin, necessity, and law. Step inside the dim corridors of a medieval brothel, and the first faces you would see were not the noblemen or the clerics who came to indulge, but the women themselves, haunted, painted, laughing, crying. They were the lifeblood of the institution, yet they were also its most expendable commodity. To understand their lives is to step into a paradox of survival and stigma, where necessity forced them into roles that society despised but could not do without. Most women did not enter the trade by choice. Many were poor widows, left without means after their husbands died of war or plague. Others were daughters of peasants who had fled the countryside, only to discover that the city offered no mercy for the hungry. Some were sold by desperate families. Others were lured by promises of work as servants, only to find themselves locked behind brothel doors. Few arrived willingly, but once within, escape was nearly impossible. The stigma clung like chains, ensuring that even if a woman left, society marked her forever as fallen. Inside the brothel, survival dictated everything. Women learned to craft masks, both literal and emotional. Painted faces with bright rouge and kohl-lined eyes concealed fatigue and fear. Forced smiles and flirtatious laughter disguised hunger and despair. Each gesture became a performance, an act of self-preservation in a world where refusal meant punishment and compliance meant survival. Some developed remarkable wit and charm, drawing wealthier clients who paid more for conversation and music than for flesh. These skills offered brief relief, but they could never erase the brand society had stamped upon them. Stigma was their constant companion. In the streets, they were forced to wear distinctive clothing, striped hoods, veils, or belts that marked them as prostitutes. This ensured that they were always visible, always othered, unable to pass unnoticed among honest women. Preachers denounced them as daughters of Eve, symbols of lust and damnation. Town records often referred to them simply as common women, stripping away their names and individuality, reducing them to faceless participants in sin. Yet within this harsh existence, small acts of resilience flickered like candlelight. Some women formed close bonds with one another, creating networks of mutual care. They shared food, protected each other from violent clients, or pooled money to bribe guards and madams. Others found ways to manipulate the system, demanding gifts in exchange for affection, setting aside coins to one day buy their freedom, or leveraging relationships with influential men for protection. These small victories were fragile, but they were lifelines in a world that offered little else. Health was another constant shadow. Brothels were hotbeds of disease, from common fevers to the far more devastating spread of venereal illnesses. Without medicine or sanitation, women suffered terribly, often bearing the blame when sickness spread through a community. Yet when they grew too ill or too old, they were cast aside, discarded like worn-out tools. The cruelty of this cycle was relentless, valued while young and healthy, abandoned when no longer profitable. Despite their hardships, the women of the brothel embodied society's contradictions. They were condemned as immoral, yet used as instruments of order. Authorities argued that they protected honest women from assault, yet they themselves endured constant abuse. They were both invisible and hypervisible, erased from respectability, yet displayed as symbols of sin. Their lives were a study in survival against overwhelming odds, where every gesture, every laugh, every negotiation was a battle against hunger, disease, and despair. In the end, These women carried the weight of a society that judged them harshly while relying on their existence. They were trapped in a cage built of coin and shame. Yet within that cage, they carved out what fragments of dignity they could. Their voices may have been silenced in records, but their presence haunts the pages of history, reminding us that the brothel was not just an institution of lust. It was a crucible of human endurance. If brothels were the stage of medieval vice, then the clients were its restless actors, each stepping into the dimly lit rooms with desires, secrets, and hypocrisies trailing behind them. From ragged apprentices to noble lords draped in velvet, all manner of men crossed these thresholds, united by one truth: desire cared little for rank or robe. Yet in the world of the medieval brothel, money dictated everything, carving distinctions even in lust. For the common laborer, entering a brothel was a rare indulgence, often purchased with the few coins left after food and ale. These men sought release from the grinding hardship of daily toil, their encounters hurried and raw, set against the smell of sweat and straw. They might boast of their adventures in the tavern afterward, but in truth, they were fleeting customers, tolerated because their pennies, however small, still fed the house. In their eyes, a brothel was less about fantasy and more about momentary escape from hunger and exhaustion. The students who filled medieval universities were another familiar presence. Young, reckless, and often flush with their father's money, they descended upon brothels in droves, earning reputations for drunken brawls and wild demands. City officials complained bitterly about their disorder, yet tolerated it. Universities brought prestige and profit, and students' coins clinked merrily into municipal coffers. Their antics reveal the uneasy bond between education and vice, where the future clerics and scholars of Europe honed their appetites as much as their intellects. Merchants, on the other hand, approached brothels with a different aim. For them, it was not only pleasure, but also display. Arriving in fine clothes, with purses heavy from trade, they used the brothel as another arena to demonstrate wealth. They paid for the most skilled women, not only for physical satisfaction, but for entertainment, songs, dances, and witty banter that elevated the experience beyond the physical. For these men, desire was intertwined with pride, a chance to prove themselves superior to poorer patrons. But the most infamous clients were the nobles and the clergy, whose very presence revealed the raw hypocrisy of medieval society. Nobles draped in silks often demanded absolute secrecy, slipping through hidden doors or veiled carriages to avoid scandal. They paid in gold, seeking youth and exclusivity, and their demands often bent or broke the unwritten laws of the trade. Tales abounded of knights sneaking away from tournaments to indulge, or lords maintaining private brothels disguised as guest houses. Their indulgence was not just tolerated, it was shielded by their power. Clerics, meanwhile, were perhaps the most controversial patrons. The very men who thundered from pulpits against lust were often caught frequenting the same houses they condemned. Bishops who profited from brothel taxes sometimes indulged behind closed doors, their double lives shielded by bribes or clerical immunity. Parish priests, forbidden to marry, often sought release within these walls, leaving behind trails of scandal whispered through towns. The contradiction was staggering. Men of God kneeling at the altar by day and slipping into brothels by night. This hypocrisy became one of the darkest stains on the Church's authority. A reminder that even those sworn to holiness were bound by human weakness. For all these clients, unwritten rules governed behavior. Nobles expected discretion, merchants demanded respect, commoners knew their place. Violence could erupt when boundaries were crossed, when a client refused to pay, or when jealousy flared. Yet, more often than not, money smoothed the chaos, Coins silenced disputes, bought loyalty, and ensured that secrets stayed hidden. The brothel was not just a house of sin, it was a theater of power where every transaction echoed the broader hierarchies of medieval life. And so, within those shadowed rooms, all of society gathered, the hungry and the powerful, the pious and the corrupt, each leaving behind their masks for a moment of indulgence. Yet when they stepped back into the streets, they carried the weight of secrecy, for brothels revealed not just desires, but the uncomfortable truth that morality could be bought, bargained, and bent by coin. The brothel, though tolerated, was never free from danger. It lived under the constant threat of punishment, scandal, and the heavy hand of public shame. For prostitutes, owners, and clients alike, one misstep could transform a private indulgence into a spectacle of disgrace. In a world where morality was shouted from pulpits and sin lurked behind every shuttered window, scandal was a currency as powerful as coin. When women defied the laws, venturing outside their permitted districts, dressing like honest wives, or soliciting too boldly in the marketplace, the penalties were severe. In many towns, they were paraded through the streets, their striped hoods ripped away, their hair shorn as a mark of dishonor. Some were flogged, others locked in the pillory, while crowds jeered, threw rotten vegetables, or worse. Public humiliation was designed not only to punish, but to remind all women of their place. The spectacle reinforced shame as a weapon, branding prostitutes as both outcasts and warnings. Clients, too, could not always escape. Students rioting in brothels were often beaten by guards or expelled from their universities. A nobleman caught too publicly risked scandal that could stain his family name, forcing him to pay enormous bribes to hush the matter. Even clerics, when exposed, faced consequences, though these often varied according to rank. A parish priest might lose his position for being caught with a prostitute, but a bishop with enough influence could bury the story under silence and coin. Hypocrisy once again dictated justice. The church, while complicit in tolerating brothels, seized upon scandal when it served its purpose. Sermons thundered against public immorality, using the downfall of known prostitutes or the exposure of clerical patrons as examples of divine wrath. Fire and brimstone preachers painted lurid images of prostitutes burning in hell, while their audiences, many of whom had visited such houses, listened with uneasy silence. Scandal, wielded from the pulpit, was a weapon to frighten the faithful into submission, even as the very same institutions profited from sin in secret. Disease, too, became a form of punishment, one that required no judge or jailer. The spread of venereal infections in brothels was both feared and used as moral ammunition. Communities whispered about the wages of sin when men returned sick, blaming the women while ignoring the recklessness of their clients. Authorities sometimes ordered infected women to be cast out, driven into the wilderness to die alone. Thus, illness itself became both a sentence and a stigma, ensuring that the brothel remained a place of both pleasure and peril. Scandals that grew too large could topple entire houses. In London, the closure of Bankside brothels in the mid-16th century came after years of mounting public pressure, fed by repeated scandals involving clergy and nobles. In smaller towns, a single accusation could spark outrage: an underage girl forced into service, a murder in a brothel chamber, or a cleric caught in flagrante delicto. These incidents became whispered legends, passed from tavern to tavern, proof that sin, no matter how hidden, would one day erupt into daylight. For the women trapped in this cycle, shame was inescapable. Even if they left the brothel, the mark of their past clung to them. Communities rarely allowed them reintegration, branding them forever as fallen. The cruelty of public shame, was that it outlived punishment, following women into old age, denying them respectability long after their service ended. A prostitute might change her clothes, her name, even her city, but the scar of stigma traveled with her, etched deeper than any flogging or fine. And yet, within these scandals and punishments, a deeper truth emerges. Medieval society needed the brothel, but it also needed to condemn it. Public shame was the performance that balanced tolerance. Punishments were not simply about justice. They were theater, a way to remind the community that sin was visible, controllable, and ultimately punished. But behind the stage, the trade continued. Coins still clinked, and doors still opened at night. No institution thundered louder against lust than the medieval church. From the pulpit, priests denounced fornication as a mortal sin, branding prostitutes as daughters of Eve and clients as weak, damned men. And yet, behind cloister walls and cathedral doors, the same church profited handsomely from the very trade it condemned. To explore the brothel's relationship with religion is to peel back one of the greatest hypocrisies of the Middle Ages, the uneasy marriage between morality and money. The theology was clear. Lust was among the deadly sins, a vice that could drag souls to hellfire. Countless sermons warned men that every coin spent in a brothel was another link in the chain of eternal damnation. Prostitutes were compared to snares of the devil, luring honest men into corruption. Confessionals echoed with guilt from clients, while penitential manuals prescribed harsh penances for both buyers and sellers of flesh. By doctrine, the church's stance left no room for compromise. Prostitution was sin, plain and simple. And yet compromise thrived. Many bishops and abbots collected taxes from brothels that operated within their jurisdictions. In London, the infamous Bankside brothels were legally owned by the Bishop of Winchester himself, giving rise to the nickname Winchester geese for the prostitutes who worked there. Across France and the Holy Roman Empire, church institutions quietly took their share of revenues, often justifying the practice with twisted logic. Better to regulate and profit from vice than allow chaos to flourish unchecked. Monastic records sometimes reveal these transactions in veiled entries, where hospitality fees, or market taxes, concealed the truth of brothel profits. Priests who lived in celibacy were notorious customers, slipping into the very houses they railed against. Parishioners, though scandalized, rarely dared to challenge such hypocrisy, for the authority of the church was immense, and scandal could be silenced with gold or intimidation. The contradiction hung over society like incense, pungent, unavoidable, and yet accepted as part of the air everyone breathed. The church's involvement went beyond passive profit. In some towns, religious officials directly oversaw regulations, setting limits on brothel districts, enforcing clothing laws for prostitutes, and collecting fines when rules were broken. This fusion of spiritual authority with practical governance made the church both moral judge and silent partner in vice. It claimed the role of guardian of purity while functioning as a landlord of lust. For the women themselves, the church offered little mercy. While sermons condemned their lives, genuine pathways to redemption were scarce. Some convents accepted former prostitutes, but only if they brought dowries or proved their repentance through grueling penance. Others were cast out, marked as beyond salvation. The contradiction was cruel. The very institution that profited from their work also slammed the door to forgiveness, branding them sinners for eternity unless extraordinary effort was made to erase their past. Yet the hypocrisy did not pass unnoticed. Medieval satirists, poets, and even reformist clerics mocked the double standards. Tales circulated of monks caught in brothels, bishops hosting secret orgies, and priests fathering children with prostitutes. These stories, half whispered and half believed, eroded the church's moral authority over time, planting seeds of doubt that centuries later would bloom into full-blown reform. But in the Middle Ages, scandal was smothered, not exposed, and the church's role remained largely hidden beneath a veil of sanctity. This tension between condemnation and profit reveals more than hypocrisy. It exposes the medieval world's struggle to reconcile human weakness with institutional power. The church sought to control every aspect of life, including desire, but it could not escape its own entanglement with sin. The brothel, in this sense, was not just tolerated by religion, it was sustained by it, an institution built as much on piety's shadow as on lust itself. Though cloaked in secrecy and scandal, the brothel was never merely a den of vice. It was a business, and like any business in medieval towns, it was woven into the lifeblood of the city's economy. To follow the trail of coins exchanged within its walls is to uncover a hidden treasury, one that municipalities and rulers quietly tapped to fund their streets, markets, and wars. Sin, in the medieval city, was not just tolerated. It was taxed, budgeted, and built into the very foundations of civic life. City officials recognized early that desire was unquenchable and thus unprofitable to ignore. Instead of suppressing brothels outright, they corralled them, sanctioned them, and made them pay. In Paris, Avignon, and London alike, brothels were granted licenses, with fees collected by local councils. Every transaction became another drop in the municipal bucket. Even fines levied against prostitutes for breaking dress codes or soliciting outside their designated districts fed directly into city coffers. Lust, paradoxically, became a civic duty. The revenue generated was staggering compared to other trades. A bustling brothel district could rival taverns and markets in profitability. Coins poured in not only from services, but from secondary businesses. Tavern owners, laundresses, musicians, and food sellers thrived around the red light districts. A prostitute's meager wage often circulated immediately back into the local economy, buying bread, wine, or candles. In this way, brothels acted as engines of urban commerce, driving trade even as they were denounced from the pulpit. City treasuries used these funds pragmatically. Roads were paved, market stalls expanded, and city guards paid with money drawn indirectly from brothel taxes. In London, part of the income from bankside brothels went to maintain the bishop's estates, while in continental towns, civic projects proudly bore the mark of funding from public revenues, a euphemism that included the shadow income of prostitution. Every stone in a bridge, every plank in a wharf, might have been purchased by coins first earned in the dim candlelight of a brothel chamber. This economic entanglement bred uneasy tolerance. Moralists clamored for suppression, but city officials turned a blind eye, recognizing the practical truth. Shutting brothels risked not only disorder, but financial loss. The rhetoric of morality bowed before the reality of coin. It was easier to brand prostitutes with shame than to abandon the wealth they generated. Thus, municipalities struck a bargain with vice. It could exist so long as it served the city. But the economics of lust also deepened inequality. Prostitutes themselves saw little of the money that flowed through their hands. Much went to brothel owners, pimps, or city officials in the form of bribes and taxes. A woman might work herself to exhaustion, yet remain trapped in poverty, while the men who managed her profited handsomely. Even the city itself, which condemned her from the pulpit, fattened its treasury with the silver she earned. The system thrived on her degradation, profiting from her survival while denying her dignity. At times, crises revealed just how dependent cities were on this hidden economy. During plagues or moral purges, when brothels were closed, municipal revenues dipped noticeably, and complaints arose from tavern owners and landlords who lost their most reliable customers. Desire, when suppressed, did not vanish. It spilled into alleys and unlicensed houses, where it could no longer be taxed. Authorities quickly realized that vice, when untamed, was less profitable and more dangerous. Thus, time and again, cities reopened brothels, justifying them as both moral safety valves and economic necessities. The brothel was therefore more than a house of sin. It was a marketplace, a treasury, a civic institution in its own right. Its coins paved streets, filled purses, and oiled the machinery of medieval life. To condemn it was easy. To live without it was unthinkable. And so, with every transaction, medieval cities revealed the uncomfortable truth. Morality might guide sermons, but money built walls, fed armies, and shaped the world. When the doors of medieval brothels finally closed, whether through plague, moral reform, or the slow tide of changing times, their echoes did not vanish. They lingered in city records, in sermons, in satirical poems, and in whispered stories passed down through generations. Today, to study these houses of flesh and coin is not to dwell on lurid detail, but to confront the raw contradictions that lay at the heart of medieval society. Brothels were not marginal. They were central, and their legacy is a window into the medieval world's tangled dance between morality, necessity, and survival. They reveal, first and foremost, a society that was profoundly pragmatic. Official condemnations of lust rang out from pulpits, yet municipal treasuries quietly counted the coins earned in brothels. Women were branded with shame, yet their labor was considered indispensable to protecting the honor of wives and daughters. Men were warned that indulgence led to damnation, yet they found avenues of secrecy, protection, and privilege to indulge without consequence. The brothel was a paradox incarnate, tolerated because it was both profitable and useful. They also expose the gendered cruelty of the Middle Ages. Women bore the heaviest weight, cast out of respectable society, forced into labor that degraded them, and punished when their service was no longer needed. Men, by contrast, often slipped away with their reputations intact, their sins buried beneath wealth or power. This imbalance was not an accident, but a design, one that reveals how medieval society structured itself upon the bodies of women, extracting both labor and shame in equal measure. Yet within this cruelty lay resilience. Women carved out fragile spaces of agency, using wit, skill, and companionship to elevate themselves above the lowest rung. Some secured enough wealth to buy independence. Others escaped into convents or marriages. Their lives, though scarred by stigma, demonstrate the human will to survive even within the harshest constraints. The memory of these women lingers in archival fragments, names in court records, fines listed in city ledgers, small voices echoing from centuries past, refusing to be entirely silenced. The legacy of brothels also shaped urban identity. Red light districts became part of the cultural memory of towns, their reputations both scandalous and inseparable from local pride. London's Bankside, Paris's Rue Bailleau, Avignon's Papal Quarter, these names carried infamy, but also familiarity. They were woven into the story of the city itself, as recognizable as cathedrals or marketplaces. Medieval citizens lived with this contradiction, condemning with one breath and joking with the next, embodying a society that could never fully reconcile its ideals with its realities. Even the Church's hypocrisy left a mark. The uneasy marriage between condemnation and profit damaged its moral authority, feeding the cynicism that centuries later would fuel reformers. When men and women saw bishops profiting from prostitution while preaching against sin, doubt crept in. The brothel thus played a hidden role in the erosion of trust that paved the way for seismic shifts in faith and power. Its legacy is not only social, but spiritual, reshaping how people viewed the institutions that claimed to rule their souls. Perhaps most importantly, brothels reveal the medieval world's obsession with control. Desire was not simply indulged, it was measured, taxed, categorized, and policed. Price lists and clothing laws turned human intimacy into regulated commodity. Underground codes ensured secrecy for the powerful, while branding shame upon the powerless. In every regulation, every bribe, every whispered story, we see a society grappling with the most human of instincts, trying to contain what could never truly be contained. In the end, the story of medieval brothels is not only about sin and scandal. It is about survival and hypocrisy, economics and morality, weakness and resilience. They remind us that beneath the gilded images of knights and castles lay a world far more complicated, where desire and coin built empires as surely as swords and prayers. Their legacy lingers not in romanticized tales, but in the stark reminder that history is not only written in marble and gold, but also in shadows, flesh, and the unspoken bargains of human need.